my last video, I made a comment that knowing how long Jesus' ministry was would help us understand more of what was in his mind when he taught. And what I'd like to do is to put some flesh on the bones of that thought in this video. So first let's consider an overview on how Jesus conducted his ministry. See, the evidence from all four gospel accounts strongly indicates that when he preached in the Jerusalem area, it was during the time of the festivals. Remember, he lived in Galilee, north of Jerusalem and Judea. So, when he preached in the area of Galilee, it was always during mid-festival periods. And why? Because during the festival periods, all male Jews were required to attend in Jerusalem. Therefore, those Jewish festival cycles, they play a crucial role in the Gospels as they provide an a chronological framework for Jesus' ministry. See, many key events in Jesus' life, his death and resurrection align with the major Jewish festivals, and thereby reinforcing the idea that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies and patterns in the Hebrew scriptures. So we find Jesus traveling down from the north into Judea and Jerusalem during these three major festival gatherings, in which all Jewish males were required to attend. And it was these festivals that provided Jesus the platform to reach Jews from all over the diaspora. They were scattered all over the place. Now, I provided a table of the festivals in chronological order in the last episode. And as an example, in that last episode, we began an examination on Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount. Where was this mount? It was the Mount of Olives, overlooking the temple in Jerusalem. And that is why this sermon is famously known as the Olivet Discourse. How many were in attendance? Well, the Gospel accounts indicate perhaps some 15,000 or so. So you can see that during festival gatherings, large crowds from all over the diaspora gathered in Jerusalem. Now, in an earlier episode of the last series, I put it that it was Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, who really established the concept of a ministry lasting 3.5 years. However, he acknowledged that earlier Christians had understood it to be about a year or so. See, in his church history, Book 1, Chapter 10, Eusebius discusses the idea of a 1-year ministry of Jesus, which follows his baptism, and he attributes this view to early Christian writers, particularly ones like Clement of Alexandria, who followed a tradition suggesting that Jesus' public ministry lasted only about a year. Here's a relevant excerpt from that, where we read, now, after his baptism, we're speaking of Jesus' baptism now, after his baptism, John the Evangelist records that he spent only 1 whole year before his passion teaching his disciples. This is also recorded in the writings of Clement, who was one of the predecessors of Origen, and in those of others. And that's from his Ecclesiastical History, Book 1, Chapter 10 and verse 3. So what changed? How did the understanding of the length of his ministry go from 1+ year to 3+ years? Well, we need to do some more digging in the field. And a good place to start would be to understand why the early Christians understood this ministry to be about a year or so, bearing in mind that they had all four Gospels that were available to them, and certainly into the second century. Now, the whole debate centers around one passage of Scripture. Yes, one Scripture found in the Gospel of John, and that's in John chapter 6 and verse 4, where we read, "Now the Jewish feast of the Passover was near." That's it. One simple Scripture. Well, not exactly. There is another in the previous chapter, John 5 and verse 1. Let's read that. "Sometime later, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." However, this scripture is definitely problematic, as it is a bit of a stretch to assume this unnamed feast was in fact the Passover feast. Unless, of course, there is a need to extend the length to 3.5 years. So let's get down to it. Now, the fact is, the earliest manuscripts dating from the 4th century all have John 6:4 in them. There are no known manuscripts without it. So what we have in John's Gospel are 3 recorded Passovers. John chapter 2 and verse 13. Let's read that. "When the Jewish Passover was near, Jesus went up to Jerusalem." John 2:13. John 6:4 we've just checked. And the third one is John 11:55, where we read, "Now the Jewish Passover was near, and many people went up from the country to Jerusalem to purify themselves before the Passover." So, if we take these 3 Passover festivals, we have a ministry of 2+ years. 3 Passover festivals, therefore 2 years plus. And if we take the questionable festival at John 5 and verse 1 as a Passover, that's it, all sorted. We have 3+ years. Problem sorted. Well, not quite. And not by a long chalk, really, because there is a lot of information in those gospel accounts that we have not considered. So let's see what we can dig up. First, let's be clear. The majority of textual critics consider John 6:4 to be original. However, there is a small minority, the likes of Gordon Fee and Bart Ehrman and some other scholars, argue that it could be a later edition. The strongest argument against John 4's authenticity is a chronological problem that it creates. And we will show that as we closely examine this matter. However, this alone does not prove that it was inserted at a later date. Right. So, upon what are such debates based? Okay, let's take the scholastic argument that John 6:4 is a later insertion. Gordon Fee, for example, textual critic, New Testament scholar. Now, Gordon Fee was actually on the committee of the New International Bible Translation, New International Version. Sadly, he passed away in October of 2022. Now, Fee was one of the most vocal proponents of the idea that John 6:4 was not original. He argued that the textual evidence specifically, variations in early manuscripts suggested that the verse was added later. He also pointed out that removing John 6:4 results in a more consistent timeline in John's Gospel, possibly aligning better with the synoptic tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which implies just the 1-year ministry of Jesus. And of course, his work also emphasized that scribes may have inserted John 6:4 to align the Gospel with a 3-year ministry tradition. Scribal insertion, that's after all not uncommon, as we have already seen, haven't we? Remember Jeremiah 8 and verse 8, the lying pen of the scribes? Okay. Bart Ehrman, another textual critic and historian, he has suggested, again, that later scribes may have altered gospel text for theological or chronological reasons. And he acknowledged this, however, that all known Greek manuscripts include John 6:4, but he raises internal consistency. What might that be? Well, if this Passover occurred, as suggested, John 6:4, why does Jesus remain in Galilee instead of going up to Jerusalem as he does for all other feasts in John? It was a requirement of male Jews to be at these 3 main gatherings, Passover being one of them. The other point he makes is the crowd's reaction, and this is in verse 15 of John chapter 6. The crowd's reaction of wanting to make Jesus a king. Now, this fits better with the Feast of Tabernacles, which had strong messianic and political expectations. And Ehrman suggests that the mention of a Passover here may have been an attempt to artificially extend Jesus' ministry to 3 years. Now, another proponent of this John 6:4 being an insertion was a French biblical scholar, Jean Carmignac. Now, he passed away in 1986. He was an expert in Hebrew and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he is best known really for his work on the Hebrew origins of the Synoptic Gospels and his research into the chronology of Jesus' ministry. Now, he specialized in the Hebrew influences in the Gospels, and he proposed really that the removal of John 6:4 results in a more natural and continuous narrative. He argued that the Passover mentioned here, it actually disrupts the flow and may have been inserted to maintain consistency with the 3-year ministry. Now, you'll remember, I did caution when reading scripture to be careful to note any disruption in the flow of a narrative, because that would be possible evidence of an insertion. So keeping that thought in mind, let's consider another thought. Let's look at John 5, verse 1 carefully again, but from a different perspective. Notice that the festival is described as a feast of the Jews. What is that telling me as a reader of this gospel? Well, it suggests to me that the writer is directing his gospel towards a readership who are not familiar with the Jews and their festivals, particularly, of course, with their festivals. Just consider the following. See, these 2 scriptures, John 6:4 and John 5 verse 1, they are fundamental to this 3.5-year understanding. But if John 5:1 was not a Passover festival, then the ministry would be reduced to 2 years plus. So let's do a little digging around the narrative of John chapter 5, just to make sure we can understand it was not a Passover festival. Let's have a look again, and this time try and fit the Passover scriptures in John's Gospel, right, into the timeline. See, remember that table that I produced in the last festival? Well, let's try and fit these Passover festivals, the 3 in John's Gospel, 2 which are highly questionable, right? Certainly. Let's see if we can fit them into that table. Now, when we have a visual before us, data becomes so much easier to grasp, doesn't it? So let's bring up that table again from the last video of these 3 main festivals. You will notice we had the Passover, Pesach, followed by the unleavened bread, 7 days, and I've got them on the first, that's the first gathering. And you'll notice this time I've put early spring, but I've put John 2:13. Okay. Then the next Passover festival, the next festival of first fruits and Pentecost, that was 50 days later. And then finally, the festival of the trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and Tabernacles, Sukkot, the main Passover festivals. And that was in September, October of the year. Now, let's see now how we can fit the chronology of the Gospels, these 3 festivals, into this table. Now, we will use this little examination really as a taster for our next video, right? So let's pick up John 2 and verse 13. Now, I've already indicated that into the table, haven't I? When the Jewish Passover was near, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. What does the account remind us of? Well, let's just read John chapter 2 and from verses 14 through to 16. In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and money changers seated at their tables. So he made a whip out of cords and drove from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned the tables. To those selling doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my father's house into a marketplace?" Ring any bells? Yeah. Mark chapter 11, verses 15 through to 17. We covered this incident in our first video of the previous series. The Passover festival in that series was at the end of his ministry. So I've entered into the table John 2:13, as you've seen. Now let's go to the next festival listed in the Gospel, John 5:1. Sometime later there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, this is the festival which the claimants of the 3+ year ministry state is the Passover festival. Now, clearly it cannot be in the same year as John 2:13. So it has to be in either the year before or the following year. It can't be in the same year. However, is this festival really a Passover festival? Note the next few verses from 2 to verse 9. chapter 5. We're going to read this. Now, there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool with 5 covered colonnades, which in Hebrew is called Bethesda. On these walkways lay a great number of the sick, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. One man there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and realized that he had spent a long time in this condition, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am on my way, someone else goes in before me." Then Jesus told him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." Immediately the man was made well, and he picked up his mat and began to walk. Now this happened on the Sabbath day. Let's take full account of this scene. As we have read it, you will have noted that verse 4 is missing. And there's a footnote in the Berean Standard Bible which informs us of this. Part of verse 3, right, in 3 manuscripts, it says, include awaiting the moving of the waters. And verse 4, from time to time an angel descended into the pool and stirred the waters. As soon as it was stirred, the first to enter the pool would be healed of his disease. So what was going on here? See, this scene is played out in full during the festival of the Tabernacles, in the autumn of the year, not in the spring. It is not part of the Mosaic law, but it was a ritual that got incorporated into the festival mainly by some influential rabbis. The superstition was that the angel that stirred the waters of the pool made the water holy, and so the high priest, every day during the festival of tabernacles, he would take a jug, fill it with water from the pool, take it back to the altar, and pour it out into the basin. That ritual became known as the water oblation. And this ritual took place during the festival of tabernacles. Therefore, this festival of the Jews was not a Passover festival. Now, that should be enough for this episode, but we will continue with this examination in our next video with some more detail of this ritual, which will help us more to see clearly what was going on in John chapter 5. Thank you very much.